Well, good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
It's nice to have better weather this week than last week. And this should be a good one. Henry VIII never is boring. But before I start, again, I must go back to the previous week to tell you what I forgot to tell you last week. Joan of Arc. And I'm thinking back, I can't believe I forgot this. So Charles VII, who was the Dauphin, his father and his mother, as we said, his mother often cheated on his father. So he wasn't always sure of his parentage. As a matter of fact, his mother often denied his rightful parentage. But Charles VI, who was supposed to be the Dauphin's father, was stark raving mad. He was periodically schizophrenic throughout his life, which of course may explain why his wife cheated on him. But the first episode of his madness was when he was out on a hunt, and something triggered inside of him, and he went absolutely berserk, and he started swinging his sword around at everybody. And by the time they tackled him off of his horse and got him down to calm him down, he had killed 4 of his bodyguards. So yeah, he was absolutely nuts. But it would come and go throughout his life. The other thing I wanted to let you know about Joan of Arc was that she was often noted as a person who cried fairly easily when someone, and usually in these situations it was tears of anger. If the English on the opposite side of the river called her a whore or a witch or whatever, sometimes she'd get very angry and she would cry. However, during her trial, 3 months of interrogations, no one ever said that she shed a tear. She stood very boldly, as I said, and answered these 60-plus clerics very strongly. So she was very brave at that point. Okay, so Henry VIII. When you think of Henry VIII, of course, you always think, here's a guy who had 6 wives, was very cruel, and somewhat, some people would think of him as a monster because of his cruelty, not just towards his wives. Get a handout? Not just towards his wives, but towards others whom he had executed as well. But if that's what you think of with Henry VIII, you have a very narrow vision of him, and I'd like to show that in this lecture. First, the bibliography, these books, and there's no lack of books on Henry VIII. They're all over the place. These are the ones who stand out for me anyway. The first one, if you want a short read that is pretty compact and will give you all the important details of his life, it's the top one that you'd want. It's very, like I said, very compact, very detailed. For a short volume, it has a lot of information. The second one, I really enjoyed reading myself because it reads like a novel. This guy, and this was back in the 20s, I believe, Francis Hackett wrote this biography. And as I say, it reads like a really good novel, getting into the personalities and describing them very intimately. So it's a very good read. not just for information, but for enjoyment as well. The most famous of the biographers is Alison Weir. She's the one who made famous The Six Wives of Henry VIII. How many of you have seen that PBS? Yeah. That's where they got the idea from. That's where they got the information from, except when the writers and directors decided it wasn't good enough and they changed it. Which, again, it irritates me to no end, especially on a mini-series that is supposed to be based on a very good history. And yet, they felt the need in a number of places to improve the story. They didn't improve it as far as I'm concerned, but that's my issue. And then she wrote, later on, she became very famous writing this biography. And so she made a career out of Henry VIII. She wrote another one, Henry VIII, about the same length, more of a focus on his life than the lives of his wives. And she also wrote about Henry's children and Henry's mother or grandmother, I forget. She wrote a number of histories, biographies of the Tudor family. And they're all very good. She's a very good historian. Fairly, I don't want to say easy to read, but interesting to read. But as I say, they are very long books. So if you want something short, you go with the top one there. So, where do we begin? The Tudor dynasty started with Henry's father, Henry VII. He defeated Richard III in 1485, ending the Wars of the Roses. And it's interesting that he claimed the crown not because he was the closest in line. He claimed the crown because of right of conquest. I beat him, therefore I'm the one who should be king. Simple as that. And one of the reasons he did that is because he knew that there were plenty of others who had a better right to the throne than he did. Many Plantagenets still around who were closer in line. So he basically said, I claim the crown because I beat the king. And here's Henry VII. Henry VII was not a popular king. He was ruthless, he was miserly, he was not loving and kind, and he was not popular. But he was a strong leader, very calculating. He knew what he was doing. And he did what he needed to do to secure his throne. So, as someone who has to deal with the powers around him, as well as the people at home, he set out to make sure that he was seen as the rightful king. He names his firstborn son Arthur. Why would an English king name his son Arthur? King Arthur, the guy who supposedly started it all. So his son Arthur is going to cement his legacy as the ruler of this new, important, powerful dynasty. He also needed to have foreign support, so he negotiates with Ferdinand and Isabella, and we all know who that is, right? Sent Columbus, 1492, all that. They had a daughter, Catherine, and at a very young age, Arthur was 2, Catherine was 3, just a few months older than Arthur. They were betrothed. And so Catherine eventually came They were, at this time, both 15 years old in 1501, and they were married. Arthur, unfortunately, was never a very healthy kid, and so he died just a few months later. And Catherine claimed that the marriage was never consummated. Now, there are witnesses who will come forward and say, Arthur, on the day after their wedding day, came and joked around and said, I was in Spain last night. So, some people say, no, it was consummated. But Catherine held to her dying day that marriage was never consummated. Catherine of Aragon, probably both the prettiest and the ugliest of Henry's wives. Prettiest when she was young, ugliest when she got older. She went through an awful lot being married to Henry. But after she was a widow, she went through a period of great uncertainty. Ferdinand, when he finds out that Arthur's dead, he immediately says, I want Catherine back, along with the dowry. And it was a substantial dowry. At least half of it was given. They wanted the other, he wasn't going to give the other half until a little bit later. So the king immediately says, look, I got another son. He's a bit younger, but I want Catherine to marry Henry now. So, no, I'm not going to send her back. I'm going to keep the dowry, but you can trust me. They will be married when Henry turns 14. So, Henry's 9 at that time. Catherine is 5.5 years older than Henry. Now, a lot of very complex negotiations and problems happen in these times that I'm not going to go into, but in 1504, right about the time when they should be getting married, Isabella dies. Now, if you remember your history way back when, you know that Ferdinand and Isabella were king and queen of separate territories that came together to make Spain, Aragon and Castile. Their heirs were to inherit a combined throne. They, as a married couple, did not technically rule together. They did, but they were still king and queen of separate territories. The agreement was that their kids would inherit a united throne. So when Isabella died, Ferdinand was now only king of Aragon, not Castile. It was the daughter Joanna who was the heir of the throne in Castile. So all of a sudden, Catherine is no longer as important as she was. So Henry VII is thinking, maybe I should get another wife for Henry. He wasn't going to tell anybody, or at least not Ferdinand, but he started looking, and he was going to find a more powerful wife for Henry, better connections. So the marriage was delayed. Henry didn't give a good excuse. He just said, we're going to wait a little bit. And but trust me, they'll be married a little later on. So Joanna, the oldest daughter, had a husband named Philip, and they were ruling Castile. Philip died. Joanna was, as I've said before about others, stark raving mad. She was emotionally unstable and well known to be before Philip died. Not helped much by Philip's philandering. He cheated on her quite frequently and quite openly. So she was an emotional wreck, and everybody knew it. When he died, she went off the edge. And she couldn't take or accept the fact that her husband was dead. So in her mind, he was not dead. They had to pry her off of him in the coffin. She wanted to hug and kiss a decaying corpse. And even once they sealed up the coffin, she took him with her wherever she went for quite some time. So, Ferdinand had his chance now that his daughter was absolutely crazy. So he had her confined in a castle, reasonably comfortably at least, for the rest of her days. Oddly enough, Joanna was actually a very attractive woman. And Henry VII, who was a widower, was thinking, maybe I should marry her. I don't care if she's crazy, she's a queen. And that's really nice territory that I could be the king of. It didn't come to anything because Ferdinand wasn't going to give her up. He had her locked away in a castle, and that meant that he was going to be ruler of Castile. So anyway, Henry VII dies in 1509, and Henry VIII, now at 17, becomes king, and very quickly decides he's going to marry Catherine to hold up the bargain, and he was happy that he did at first. For several years at least, he was perfectly happy with her. And she is known as a pious, good-natured woman, submissive, which is what Henry really liked as well, and very pretty at first. Yeah. So Henry VIII, just to give you an idea of Henry, he was 6'3" and a very athletic, good-looking 6'3". Blue eyes, auburn hair, and he was like the Adonis of Greek mythology, and people would look to him and other ambassadors from foreign countries would just be in awe of him, saying that the rest of Europe could only wish to have a king like this. So he's the guy who looked like he could do it all. He was very athletic. He loved sports. He loved hunting. He loved jousting. He could dance, fencing, archery. It was said that he was as good as any of the best archers in his army. And funny little side thing is that he loved his calves. When a new king of France, Francis I, became king of France, and it was said that he was a very good-looking guy. Henry's talking with his ambassadors, and he was comparing himself to Francis, and he would say, "Look at my calves. Does he have calves like this?" So, yeah, Henry was very vain. That was well known of him. But boy, did he look like a king. And everybody he was a very popular king, even throughout the terrible things that he did. He generally remained pretty popular because he not only looked like a king, he acted like a king, he had the charisma that everybody was attracted to. This painting, by the way, by many in Europe at the time was considered obscene because of his boldness, and not to mention the codpiece there, which nowadays looks just ridiculous that a man would do such a thing. But that was the fashion. And Henry wanted to show off all of his attributes. And people were in awe of him. He was also intellectual. He was a patron. He was a patron of the great minds of the day, Erasmus, Sir Thomas More, and others. He spoke 5 languages: English, Latin, French, Italian, and Spanish. English, Latin, and French, he was very fluent both speaking and writing, and it was known that his letters to various heads of state were among the best written of the day. And he enjoyed intellectual discussions with the great minds of the day, and he could discuss math, astronomy, divinity, and the Greek and Roman classics very intelligently. And of course, Henry was a musician as well. He played the lute, the harpsichord, the recorder, the flute, and the virginal, which is one of those tinny sounding pianos that they had back in those days. He composed music. He did not compose green sleeves. That is the one piece that everybody thinks he composed, and he did not. He could have, though. He had the talent for composing musical pieces. And we know of 33 that exist. And they range from anthems, hymns, and courtly love songs. He loved the courtly love songs the best. And he was a fun-loving king. He had pageants. A pageant, back in those days, was a primitive sort of dramatic performance in which women would come onto the stage and dance and sing, and then a stage prop on wheels would come in with men. And the men would come in and they would do there would be some theme to the whole thing, whether it's Robin Hood or the ancient Greeks and Romans or whatever. And the men would perform as if they were fighting each other, and they would do dances and sing, and then at the end, the men and the women would get together. Henry loved them, and he was a performer. He could dance and sing with the best of them, and he did. Catherine, on the other hand, truly enjoyed watching Henry, but she didn't usually perform herself. And then there were the masks, which is a little more developed form of drama at the time, which had more of a plot. But again, you'd have some sort of theme to the whole thing, and they would sing and dance and do some mock battles, and the tournaments. Henry was one of the best at jousting, and he would joust. They'd have a tournament, and of course, jousting is only one of the events at the tournament, and Henry would be in as many events as he could fit himself into. And he would joust, and sometimes he would be thrown from his horse. One of his great injuries, that we'll talk about later, was from jousting. And here's a jousting tournament there. Henry was also a prankster. He loved getting dressed up in disguise and then surprising his wife. He would dress up, say, as a commoner or a knight errant, and with some of his buddies put on some sort of display in front of his wife, and then remove his costume and say, "Hi, you didn't know it was me, did you?" And she's probably like, "Yeah, sure, okay, I'll go with that." But he's 6'3". How's he going to disguise that? But he also would disguise himself and go into town and talk amongst common people. Not always, since photographs didn't exist and paintings were rare, many people didn't know what he looked like, and he could go in and converse with ordinary people in London or wherever town he's at, and he thoroughly enjoyed that. He was the type of guy who could be happy talking with just about anybody. Oh, I have to tell you, one of the pageants or masks, he got the idea that he was going to allow commoners to come in and watch, which was pretty much unheard of. You don't let the common, unwashed rabble into your palace to watch this. This is all for the aristocracy. But Henry decided he was going to allow some commoners to come in and watch the pageant. And it got way out of control. There were too many of them in there, and they started grabbing things. This is the poor, the rabble, who looked around at the splendor, and he had a magnificent court. They are looking around at the splendor of this court and the clothing that people were wearing, and they started taking things. And Henry was okay with it. He thought it was a riot. They started taking the clothes off of his back. And they started taking clothes from some of the other nobles. One in particular was stripped naked. And Henry was just laughing about it until they started taking the clothes of the women. At that point, he said, "No, we're done here," and dismissed them. But he had a grand old time, and he gave away all kinds of stuff: jewels, rings, clothing, satin, silks that people were wearing. Very fun-loving guy. The one thing that he did not like much as king was the politics of it. The meeting of the Privy Council, in which his counselors would get together and discuss the issues of the day, they had to practically drag him into it. He never liked it. It's dull, it's boring, it's no fun. I don't want to do it. But occasionally they would talk him into it. So he had his ministers, and some of which were very good, very capable men. He would have them, the first several years of his reign, do all the heavy lifting as far as administrative work goes. And as we know, he was vain, he was proud, short-tempered, and very immature. And one of the odd things about Henry, I don't know how odd really, but he couldn't stand for people to stare at him in the face. And if you think about it, that makes sense. For a big, macho sort of person to have another man look at him is a threat. You'll see that in everyday life. For some thug on the street, they always tell you, don't look at him, because that's a threat. They'll come up to you and attack just because you're looking at him. And Henry was immature in that way. He did not want anybody staring at him, men in particular. Queen Catherine, she's under 5 feet tall, very petite. She was very religious, very pious, also very good-natured, kind, and what Henry needed, she was mature. And it was often said that Henry, in the early years, often deferred to her judgment when an issue came up. He was perfectly happy to let her make the decisions on many things. She was not as intelligent as Henry, but she was wiser and more mature. And as I said, she didn't really participate in his antics and his plays and his performances, but she did enjoy watching, and she flattered his pride enough to make him happy. And it was noted by pretty much everyone that this seemed to be a very happy couple. They enjoyed being together, and they were together quite a lot, as far as kings and queens back in those days, comparatively speaking. As I said, he often relied on her good advice because she was a very sensible woman. And when he would go off on his campaigns, and there were always, not always, there were often campaigns that could be taken by Henry to go attack somebody. There was always some war or other going on, and Henry loved fighting. So on his occasional campaigns, she was left in charge as the regent. Catherine, unfortunately, had a very hard time bearing children. Maybe it was just the size difference. Henry's a large man, she's a small woman, and she had somewhere between 6 and 8 pregnancies. We know that there were 6. We believe there may have been a couple more that were terminated shortly, stillborn. So the first 4 were all stillborn. And this is a terrible blow to the pride of a man like Henry, who absolutely needed a son. And then Princess Mary, the one child that survived, was a woman, and she was born in 1516. And after Mary, there was one more pregnancy that we know of, and again, it was either stillborn or died very quickly afterwards. Of these 6 pregnancies, we know that at least 3 of them were boys. And so, again, is a terrible, heavy blow to Henry. By the time Catherine was in her early 30s, she was no longer the young beauty that she was. After so many pregnancies, she appeared visibly, and many people noted this. She was visibly aged. She was way overweight and very tired often. So this is Queen Catherine a little later on. Not the youthful beauty that she was. And as we know, Henry was famous for his affairs. The first one started, at least the first one that we know about, he was actually very discreet about his affairs, not wanting Catherine or many people to know about them. And so the first one that we know of, there may have been some earlier, was about 2 years into the marriage. And when Catherine found out about it, she was livid. She cried, she yelled, she was very angry with Henry, and they had a big fight over this affair. But Henry stood his ground, like most sovereigns of the day. The kings felt they had the right to have any woman, ladies in waiting generally, that would submit to him. And so he did not give in, and he continued. Catherine did give in, and she accepted at one level or another that that's who Henry was, and he was not going to change. And so she just lived with it. So the first major affair that lasted some time, Elizabeth Blount and the only bastard that we know of, Henry Fitzroy, born in 1519. Henry Fitzroy, at this point, Henry VIII is thinking, and we're not sure when he started thinking about getting rid of Catherine, but this must have been a big blow to him that he has a son, but it's not a legitimate son. And then he has an affair with Mary Boleyn. The last name may sound familiar to you. The older sister of Anne. And this affair went on for a number of years. And by the way, Mary is a married woman through this time. And by 1524, Henry has stopped having sexual relations with Catherine because he sees her as not at all physically attractive. And we know this because he confessed this to one of his advisors. Not that they were having much sexual relations before that. It diminished as the years went by. And one of the interesting things, too, that we know about Henry's interactions with Catherine, the affairs of state between the king and the queen are so important that it was often an announced thing that Henry was going to sleep with his wife tonight. They had separate compartments, separate rooms. And so when Henry decided he was going to sleep with his wife, that was an announced thing. And all the court knew it. Oh, Henry's going to sleep with Catherine tonight. How about that? Now, occasionally, he would sneak in, and supposedly no one was going to know about it. Maybe he just didn't feel like announcing his intentions of sleeping with his own wife. But for the most part, it was an announced thing. But as the years went by, Henry found the young ladies-in-waiting more appealing than his wife. And then we come to Anne Boleyn. She was young and pretty-ish. She was not known, and this is an interesting thing about all of Henry's wives. None of them were known as exquisite beauties. They were mostly chosen by him. The ones that he chose because he knew them were chosen for their charm more than their beauty. And Anne Boleyn, certainly she was pretty, but not the prettiest. She was charming. She had that feminine allure that many men found very enticing. One of the things about the birth dates on a number of these people, Henry's wives, there were no birth records back in those days. There has to be a certain amount of investigation done to figure out how old they were. Depending on which biography you read, Anne Boleyn could be various ages, not just 1500 or 1501. Some of them have her 5 or 6 years younger, because we really don't know for sure. I'm going with the date that Alison Weir gives, and she gives her reasons for it. So anyway, again, petite. She's only about 5 feet tall, but she's very charming. She loves music and dancing, as Henry does as well. She's also very calculating, very intelligent, and somewhat ruthless in her plotting, which eventually did her in. She was a lady in waiting upon Catherine. And by the way, when we say a lady in waiting or an attendant on the queen, that doesn't necessarily mean she was a close attendant. Queens in these days often had hundreds of attendants. Catherine had about 160. So we're not really sure how close Anne was to Catherine. So here's Anne Boleyn. So a pretty young girl, not the prettiest among the many ladies in waiting, but she was certainly the most charming. You'll notice the rose that she has. This was still a big thing, the Wars of the Roses. It's important that you love red in this case. So Henry started sending gifts to Anne about 1525. It's an approximation. Anne at first knows what she's dealing with. She's a young girl, but she wants to play for keeps. Henry has already discussed the idea of an annulment with Catherine. It's not widespread, not many people know it, but he has, before he starts flirting with Anne Boleyn, which is important to note because some people will say that Anne Boleyn was the cause of it all, that Henry saw her and decided, hey, she's really what I want, so I'm going to get rid of Catherine. She probably accelerated the process because he really did want her, but he probably would have done it anyway. But once he starts flirting with Anne, she's playing coy. She's not going to give in right away. She doesn't want to be just another mistress. She wants the whole thing. She wants to be the wife. She wants to be the queen. And she has some hints that she could do it. And so somewhere around the winter 1526, 1527, Henry has decided that he really wants her and wants her for a wife. So he asks Anne to marry him. At this point, Anne is thinking that now she has the fish on the hook and she's going to reel him in. However, it was not going to be easy and it was not going to be quick. Henry, thinking that he could get an annulment, after all, his wife was his brother's wife before him. Going back to the Bible, depending on which passage you are looking at, the Bible says that a man will not marry his brother's wife. There's another passage, of course, that says if the brother dies without any kids, then the other brother is to marry the wife, the widow, in order to have kids. And so this is what's been wrangling back and forth. But ultimately, that's not really what was at issue. What was at issue is Henry going to get permission from the Pope or not? Under ordinary circumstances, it would have been a fairly easy thing to do, and this is what Henry was counting on. All you have to do is go to the Pope as a sovereign of a powerful nation, maybe grease the wheels a little bit with some money, and the Pope will say, sure, I understand, I'll grant you an annulment. The first marriage was, she was married before, you shouldn't have married her, therefore you have an annulment. And it's important to know too, he was not seeking a divorce. Usually when we talk about Henry and his wives, he's either divorcing them or cutting their heads off. He did not divorce any of his wives. You get an annulment. You cannot get a divorce back in those days. An annulment says that the original marriage was not valid. Therefore, it's as if it never existed. That's what they would do back in those days. So Henry's thinking, it'll be tough, it won't be easy, but within a few months I could probably get an annulment. So Henry confronts Catherine with this. She breaks down and sobs uncontrollably, and she isn't going to give him up. It was a very ugly scene. But Henry, with his faithful Cardinal Wolsey, sends him to the Pope to get the annulment. He could not have chosen a worse time. Catherine had a nephew who is now Charles V, who is the Holy Roman Emperor, very powerful monarch. Charles V his soldiers have just sacked Rome. He had a war with the Pope. He invaded Italy. He didn't command them to do it. They had surrounded Rome, and then, for whatever reason, soldiers being what they are, got out of hand, and they totally destroyed the city of Rome and captured the Pope. And at this point, Charles V is thinking, okay, I didn't order them to do it, but I'm kind of glad they did, because now I have the Pope in my back pocket. So Pope Clement, that unfortunate pontiff, could not grant Henry anything that Charles didn't want him to. And Charles was very upset that Henry was treating his aunt in such a way. And so Charles was not going to allow the annulment. And there's Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor. You'll notice his chin, his lower jaw. There was so much inbreeding amongst the Habsburgs, he could not close his mouth entirely. He had this big jutting chin. But his intellect was still intact. And then there's Pope Clement, who was a captive of Charles V and would only do what Charles told him. So Henry's thinking, well, what else can I do? He put pressure on Catherine. If she agreed to the annulment, maybe that would make it easier. She would not. As I said, she was a very pious, very religious, good Catholic. She was not going to give in, and she adamantly insisted, again, this was kind of a sticking point, that the first marriage was never consummated. Therefore, I was never truly married to your brother. But that, of course, that really didn't matter to Henry or to anyone else. Another way out is to tell her, look, I will send you to a nunnery, and you could spend your days there. You like being very religious. This would be a nice thing for you. And again, she would not. She wanted to be queen. She felt it was her calling, her duty, to stand up for her rights as queen. And she was also a very popular queen, because everybody knew she was a very kindly, pious sort of woman. One of the few times when Henry was not so popular in his reign as king. She was called before what was called the Black Friars, who were Dominican monks, and almost like an inquisition, they questioned both Henry and Catherine stood her ground very strongly, insisting always that she was his true wife. And so this went on for years. By 1531, Henry finally decided he needed to make a break with Rome. This was the fateful decision that had consequences well beyond just his personal issues. So he told the clergy in England that he was now the head of the church. They were to answer to him and not to the Pope. That didn't go down well. As you might imagine, there were quite a number of rebellions because of this, but overall, Henry, because of the force of his character, pushed this through, and it was accepted generally. Those who did not accept it were imprisoned, oftentimes either burned at the stake or had their heads lopped off. And this happened to quite a number of people, both clerics and the laity, who dared question Henry's supremacy. So Henry now has his way, and just before they get married, Henry starts sleeping with Anne, and then early in 1533, they were married. Kind of a quiet, secret wedding. They didn't want to announce, they didn't want to make a big show of it, but they were married. Interestingly, before the annulment. But as far as Henry was concerned, and as we know, what an annulment is not the end of a marriage. It is declaring that the marriage never existed. So it was perfectly okay for Henry to get married and then have the annulment. The annulment just makes it all go away. Yes?
Was this annulment issued then by Henry's new Church of England?
Yes. Yes.
Not the Pope.
Yes. And they would do what he told them to do. He had a very, as I said, Henry's counselors, by and large, were very talented, intelligent men. And he had the Archbishop Cranmer was the ideal man for him because he was capable, intelligent, he was very pious and religious, and he would do whatever Henry told him to do. Some of Henry's other counselors, whether Cardinal Wolsey or Thomas Cromwell, were also very capable, very loyal to Henry, but they were unscrupulous as well. And they would do whatever Henry told them to do, and they would do it with relish, whether it's just an ordinary assignment or making sure that the right people were accused and executed, they would do it. Queen Anne, never a very popular queen. People blamed her. Generally speaking, you do not like to blame your king for anything. It's always somebody else's fault. And Henry, being a popular, charismatic sort of guy, was almost never blamed for what went wrong in his kingdom. It was always somebody else's fault. And here we have Anne Boleyn. It was obviously her fault that all of these terrible things happened. But at first, Anne was going to produce an heir, and that's really what Henry needs. So she got pregnant right away. She had Elizabeth. In 1533, Henry was happy. He could be happier with a boy, though, but he'll accept this. She can produce an heir. She is, however, in many ways, very much like Henry, and that's not a good combination. She was headstrong, proud, vain, very calculating, and they had this volatile relationship where they would fight and yell and scream at each other, and then once everything was calmed down, they would have this emotional reunion and still be in love with each other. Unfortunately for Anne, all of this, all of her negativeness with the people and with Henry could have been forgiven if she would just have a boy. Instead, she had 2 miscarriages. At this point, not only is she unpopular with the people and most of Henry's counselors, Henry's having second thoughts as well. Henry's getting very tired of Anne and her arrogance, There's only room enough for his ego, not hers. And so he's thinking of a way out. Unfortunately for him, there isn't anything that's obvious. It was his own clerics who married them, who decided that the previous marriage was null and void. And so how are we going to do this? Well, he has his faithful counselor, Thomas Cromwell. Cromwell is the fixer. In our day, he could be a very good crime boss. He could manage things. If somebody needed to be knocked off, he could do it and make it look good. So Cromwell plots and puts together this plan. We got to get rid of Anne, and we have to make it big. It's not just going to be she cheated on Henry. She cheated on Henry, and she plotted to kill Henry. And she had incest with her brother, just thrown in for good measure. And so this was put together very quickly. It was not something that it needed to be drawn out. It's very important that it's done quickly before people start questioning the evidence, which is entirely made up. Here's Thomas Cromwell. Look at that face. That's the guy that, if you want something done, good, bad, or indifferent, he would do it no matter what to serve his king. So look at the timeline here. Anne is arrested on May 2nd. Anne is tried on May 15th, and she is executed on the 19th. Henry, by this time, already has his next wife. Henry's betrothed to Jane Seymour the day after Anne is executed. How many of you have seen the movie Anne of 1,000 Days? It completely misrepresents what happened. Henry is not pining away for Anne Boleyn. She had no power over him as the movie portrays. He was done with her before she was executed, and he was looking elsewhere. He has a new woman in his life. Jane Seymour, he was courting months before Anne was gotten rid of. So now, to look at why would Henry do this? Well, as I said, there were personality clashes. She was unpopular. And he also wanted to get back in the good graces of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. His international relations had soured completely because of what he had done. So he had Anne Boleyn as his scapegoat. I'll get rid of her and things will be much better. And of course he has Jane Seymour, and the two miscarriages, probably most of all, is what did Anne in. So Jane Seymour, she's 25 years old. She's about 5'2", which at the time was fairly common for women. This is about the average height of a woman back in those days. She was a thin but buxom woman. I had to look that one up to make sure I knew what that was. And by your reaction, you already know. So that was nice for Henry. He likes that. So he likes the buxom women. She was a modest, submissive sort of woman, and she was a stickler for court etiquette. People noted that. And she was a good Catholic, but she was perfectly okay with seeing Henry as the head of the church in England. And she also started a relationship with Henry's daughters, Mary and Elizabeth. Elizabeth's very young at this point, but Mary's growing into a young woman, and she wanted to be a good stepmother to the both of them, and she was. And, but most, I won't say most importantly, but very important, she could deal with Henry's sour temper, and it was getting more and more sour the older Henry got. So here's Jane Seymour. Again, somewhat of a plain-looking sort of woman. As I said, none of Henry's wives were outstanding beauties, except maybe his first, as she was younger. And now at last, Henry has a male heir. Jane fairly quickly got pregnant, but it was not a good labor for her. She was in labor for 3 days, and I'm sure some of you women out here can relate to how awful an experience a drawn-out labor is. And she did not survive. There were great celebrations that Henry now has a son. Henry couldn't have been happier. And then a few days later, because of a uterine infection, Jane dies. Here's a family portrait that was done. Jane is inserted into the portrait posthumously. Henry stated later that this was his favorite wife, probably because she died and gave him an heir. And I'm not saying this facetiously. Although it sounds that way, doesn't it? My take on this is that it's very common when someone dies that you think more highly of them than you would have otherwise. So, Jane Seymour dies. Everybody's very sad. But Henry has an heir. Prince Edward. Very cute painting here. And now Henry needs another wife. I better hurry up here. And he's going to use this next wife as a tool to improve his relations with foreign countries. He looks to Charles V. He looks to Francis of France. And there are girls that are available. But then he goes to Cleves, which is a duchy right on the edge of the Netherlands, the Low Countries. And the reason that he chooses this, it has almost nothing to do with Anne of Cleves, but Francis of France and Charles V of the Holy Roman Empire seem to be getting together in league against Henry. So he's going to choose someone who might help him in that contest of countries. And so Cleves is an important territory, and if he's in league with the Duke of Cleves, he has some leverage against Francis and Charles. So he sends Hans Holbein to do her picture, do a portrait of her. And so he does. And he gets his counselors to interrogate, come see her, interview her, and they come back and say, she's wonderful, she's pretty, she's just what you want. There's Anne of Cleves. And that's the portrait that Hans Holbein did of her. Unfortunately for Henry, it doesn't much look like her. In subtle ways. It's very easy to take a rather drab, plain-looking person and make them look nicer than they really are. And that was, as a court painter, that's what you do. You make your subjects look good. And so he did. And when Henry at last met her himself, he was outraged. His first comment as he was leaving her apartment when they first met, "I like her not. She is not what I was told she was. She's dull. She's plain. She's not pretty at all. She's not educated at all. She's rather dull-witted." And the first meeting especially was difficult because she didn't speak English. And so Henry was upset. She had very little education. She wasn't into music or dancing. Nothing what Henry wanted. But Henry was in a pickle at this point. He could not back down. He was in a bad spot internationally, and he had to marry her. So he did. But he only needed to stay with her until the international scene changed somewhat. And that's all he did. He was very open, mostly, about not liking his queen. He didn't, most likely, consummate. He said that he never consummated the marriage, which is believable because he was suffering from impotence at this point. Off and on, he was simply just not able to perform. And when he could, it was only with someone who was very attractive. And Anne was not. And so after about 6 months, he gets an annulment. Never consummated, and he has the clergy in his back pocket anyway. They'll do what he says. So here's Henry at 48 years old. He has a waistline of 54 inches. He is a large man, not just tall, but he is wide. He has an abscess in his leg that he got from a jousting accident, and he stinks. The abscess stinks. He has to be dressed. This wound that does not go away has to be dressed daily. He often could not walk, needed a hoist to get onto his horse whenever he rode, and he was getting more and more irascible and moody and difficult to be around. This is Henry, and this painting is about this time. I don't know exactly, but this is round about the time Henry's in his late 40s. And by the way, on the one side, all of those portraits are Henry in different ages. I think I wrote the age on the ones that I knew, and they are generally approximations that should be close to accurate. So, not wanting to get rid of one wife before he has another one in hand, Henry starts an affair with Catherine Howard. Catherine Howard is often compared to Anne Boleyn, and they have some similarities. Catherine Howard is a cute-ish sort of woman who was very alluring, knew how to manipulate men with her sexual presence. She was the youngest. Again, Alison Weir, the historian, says she was 15. Other historians will tell you she's more like 19 or 20 or somewhere around there. We're not sure. I go with Alison Weir. She gives good reasons why she believes the younger age is correct. Anyway, she had a slight build, as all of them did. She was very charming. She knew how, as I said, she knew how to work her magic on men. And importantly, too, she was already sexually experienced. She was also very vain and greedy. And when Henry came and showed attentions to her, she was going to go for it all, just like Anne Boleyn. And she wanted Henry as a husband. And so, quickly after the annulment, Henry was married to Catherine Howard. Unfortunately for Henry, again, this did not work out. Henry was probably more infatuated with Catherine Howard than any of his other wives. She knew how to manipulate Henry. She knew how to flatter him. And Henry just ate it up. Unfortunately, Henry could not reciprocate and give Catherine what she wanted emotionally. And so she started having an affair with a man that she had had an affair with prior to Henry. And here's another weird sort of thing in all this. The woman, the lady in waiting that helped this affair along, would sneak her man in and out, was the mother of Anne Boleyn. You would think she would know better. But she didn't. And she paid dearly for it. So it was found out initially that Catherine Howard was not a virgin. And then in the investigation, it was found out that she was currently having an affair with another man. And so Henry, more than any other wife, he was terribly distraught. Henry didn't want to get rid of this one, but she was genuinely a conniving sort of woman who was having an affair. And so he had to get rid of her, along with the men that she had had sexual relations with, and Lady Jane. And then we come to the last, Catherine Parr. Catherine Parr didn't happen right away. He wasn't looking. So he didn't have someone in the wings, as it were, when Catherine Howard was executed. At this point, Henry needs a nursemaid. He doesn't need a wife. So Catherine Parr was right for him. She's 31. She'd been widowed twice, although she never had any kids. She was very plain, but lively and friendly, and just the sort of woman that Henry wanted in his old age. And so they were married 1543. And there she is, Catherine Parr. Now, oddly enough, Anne of Cleves, I should have mentioned, she was treated actually very nicely because she went along with the annulment and she cooperated. She was perfectly fine. Maybe she knew that she was better off without Henry. And maybe she knew that she was better off not having her head cut off. But she accepted the annulment graciously, and Henry was kind enough to, since she was cooperative, he gave her a house in the country with many attendants and an allowance. And so she lived out her days quite comfortably and quite accepting that Catherine Howard would take her place. She was not happy, however, when Henry married Catherine Parr, because she recognized Catherine Howard as a young, pretty girl. Of course, Henry's going to like her. But when he married Catherine Parr, she was insulted. I'm prettier than Catherine Parr. Why is he going for her? She was almost expecting Henry to come back to her. At least to flatter her, and but he didn't. And so Anne was somewhat upset that Henry married again. But Catherine was what Henry wanted. She enjoys music, dancing, clothes, gardening, and she was a very good stepmother. Again, here's another one who's going to be a stepmother to the orphaned girls. And so Princess Mary, who's now 27, is just a few years younger than Catherine Parr. And here's Henry, the old man. It was said that his face could favorably be compared to a potato. Catherine, she survived Henry, but only by a hair. Catherine was a religious sort of person, and she actually wrote meditations, religious meditations, that slanted towards Lutheranism. And she often had discussions with Henry of religion, and sometimes Henry would get upset at her beliefs, thinking that she was too much of a Protestant. And so his counselors some of whom didn't care much for Catherine, thinking that here's another wife we can get rid of, came to Henry and said, we need to arrest her on charges of heresy. This is very serious stuff. So we need to take care of her. And this was at a point when Henry was probably in a very bad mood towards his wife and towards the world. And so he said, sure, I'll sign it. Just a few days later, Henry is walking in the garden with Catherine, completely forgetting that she is to be arrested. And when the soldiers come to arrest her, Henry is, of course, outraged and calls them all kinds of names. You knave, you fool, get out of here. And so he has to tell Catherine, I totally forgot I had you. I signed your arrest warrant. Silly me. So Catherine, she actually had known that this was coming and had come to Henry in advance and said, I'm so sorry. I will submit to anything you tell me. I was just trying to work these things out in my own head. So Henry, of course, forgave her and went on. I just wanted to show you this. This is in very nice suit of armor that Henry had. The last campaign. How he did it, I don't know. He was a large, bloated sort of man, but he wanted to go on campaign one last time. He went to France. He captured the city of Boleyn. I hope I'm pronouncing that again. My French is... Do I have my French? Good. Captured the city. It cost far more than he got out of it. He sold it back to the French, still at a great loss. But ultimately, that's not what he was about. He conquered. He was the conqueror, and that's what he thoroughly enjoyed. And then he died January 28th, 1547. But he has his son, the new king, Edward VI. And he was happy. Any questions, comments? Yes?
You concentrated mostly on Henry's domestic life. What were his major accomplishments and failings as a king?
His major accomplishment, one of the things that he was known for as being the man who created the British Navy. He really put a lot of funds into building up the Navy. And of course, he became the guy who broke away from the Catholic Church, which was a really big deal. There are a number of things that I wish I could mention along with that, but that in and of itself was a tremendous event in history, and in some ways a very positive one, because despite Henry's own intentions, there were some positive good that came out of breaking the power of the papacy in that day. He dismantled the monasteries and brought England into a more rational frame of mind, I think. There was a terrible cost. Many thousands lost their lives because of it. But, yeah.
You mentioned just building up the British Navy. Was that in response to Spain's building up its navy with all the gold and silver it was getting out of the New World?
No. It was because Henry loved war. Henry wanted to be a powerful monarch. And so he built up his, he had several palaces. He was known as a very rich king. Henry VII, his father, very miserly, really built up the treasury. Henry had a lot of money he could spend when he inherited the throne, and he spent it. And he had a very lavish court, and he wanted to build up his navy and his military because he was the type of guy who loved going out on campaigns and conquering new lands.
One final question. Did the discovery of the New World have any impact on Henry?
Not much. I mean, that was in the air, and everybody knew that was kind of a new thing. But I don't believe it had much impact on Henry as far as thinking of exploring the New World. It didn't really much. And this is really before Spain started taking in tons and tons of gold, which only started as Henry got older. Yes?
You didn't mention his mother.
Yes, I didn't. And since we're way over time, I really couldn't mention much. She died when Henry was